All right, those of you who didn't get the first part of Chapter 7, you weren't in class to hear the lecture. Welcome to the beginning of Chapter 7. We've already covered the central nervous system, which sort of controls everything. Then we did cardiac. So we have circulation. And now we're going to have airway and breathing. And so Chapter 7 deals with medications for respiratory conditions. So by the time you hit this point, you're halfway there. You're not only halfway through your junior term, but you are halfway through your whole nursing school experience. So that's pretty good. So drugs for allergies and other respiratory problems is sort of a short chapter, pages 106 to 124, just 18 pages. So it's really not too difficult. It will be combined with Chapter 8 for your next chapter test, which is, I think, test 5 or 6. Can't remember. But Chapter 7 and 8 will be covered together in your test the week after the midterm. ATI chapters 16 and 17, and I would encourage you to make sure you read those two because there are a couple of meds I talk about that the book doesn't really dwell on, and you might run into them on your chapter tests and on your ATI. So next few pages just kind of talk about what we're going to talk about, and rather than talk about what we're going to talk about, I'm just going to talk about it. So let's talk about allergies. You just got done with the immune system for Ms. Collette's Med-Surg. So I expect you to know all about the immune system and recognize these phrases that come up when we're talking about allergic reactions. So an allergy is kind of a hyper responsiveness of the immune system to a foreign protein. Generally speaking, our immune system is supposed to protect us from pathogens like bacteria and viruses, sometimes even fungus that end up where they're not supposed to. But with allergies, your immune system is just hyper-reactive. It's like the kind of anxious, hysterical person that, screams anytime anything startles it. That's a overreaction to things like pollen, dust, mold, pet dander, just things that the immune system just gets all torn up about when it doesn't need to. So it's considered to be a hypersensitivity. Many times you'll hear allergy and hypersensitivity referred to interchangeably. They're the same thing. And basically what you're doing is you're responding, you see this word antigen. It refers to a foreign protein that comes into the body. And then if it's a bacteria or a virus, your body sets up an antigen-antibody reaction that helps should you run into that bacteria or virus in the future. But when it comes to allergies like pollen and things like that, it's not a pathogen, so your body can't set up an antibody reaction. It's just going to keep trying and calling up all these inflammatory mediators that you don't need. And let's talk about the upper and lower respiratory tract before we talk about histamine. So this is just sort of a cartoon that shows the upper respiratory tract. It's very common to catch a cold or otherwise feel really crummy in your nose or throat. And you go to the doctor and the doctor says, you just got a URI, an upper respiratory tract infection. And so anything that affects the nose and the back of the nose, which is called the nasopharynx, or the mouth or the back of the mouth, which we would call the throat, but is also called the oropharynx, and then our larynx, the voice box. That all kind of makes part of the upper respiratory tract. The book tends to include the trachea as part of the upper respiratory tract, but it's actually sort of both. The trachea goes on down from the naso and oropharyngeal areas past the larynx down into the lungs. So if I was going to categorize it, I would consider it more part of the lower respiratory tract, which includes the left and right main bronchus, the bronchial passages, and branches off into the alveoli, which are just, countless little microscopic structures that branch off the tiniest part of the bronchioles and are surrounded by capillaries and help us with our exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide. Here in the next, you see the trachea is considered part of the upper respiratory system. So the good news is you really will not have a test question that differentiates between the two of them, so you can kind of put it wherever you want. Generally, upper respiratory infections tend to be less of a problem than lower respiratory infections because there's just a lot more possibility for problems and infections when you're talking the actual air exchange down in the lungs. The sinuses you see are included here. Sinuses aren't actual organs, they're air cavities behind the nose and the eyes and the mouth, and they're just set up to make the skull lighter. If you had just solid bone, your head would be so heavy you couldn't hold it up. And by making many of them air passages, it just makes things lighter. Trouble is, where there are empty spaces and there's an illness, the inflammatory system wants to fill it with mucus and edema from the inflammatory response, and our sinuses get filled with fluid and get very uncomfortable. So the first thing we're going to talk about is histamine. Histamine is one of the initial substances that is produced when there's an inflammatory reaction, and the immune system reacts by just breaking cells and releasing histamine all over the place. And in a minute, we will talk about what that histamine actually does when you have an allergic reaction.